284 in the blue hymnal. Let's stand to sing this one. 404.
The
Last song before the opening, number 380. 380.
Well, good morning. Welcome to Lewiston Bible Church this morning. It's good to be with you again. This morning we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 20, verses 1 through 26, and Brother Sheldon will be bringing the message this morning. As I considered this role as worship leader, I had the opportunity to, play devil's advocate last night in a youth activity as they were simulating what it would be like to hide to do church, and what that looks like. And my job was to be, as I said, devil's advocate, to kind of come against them and kind of question them. And it really struck me as I was driving to the activity, as I was preparing myself mentally to question a Christian. And what mental space I was getting into became really dark as the questions kind of bombarded me. Like, what would be the best argument to really make someone question their faith and question, why they're doing what they're doing, why they're choosing to be different. And like I said, it was kind of a dark headspace to really be in. And I'm glad I didn't have to be there for long. But I was struck by the beauty of a God who is not afraid of that space, is not afraid of those really difficult questions that we come into in life. And as you study other religions, you'll find a lot of very authoritarian gods that don't provide much in the way of lenience or even questioning. I should just say questioning. It's just, this is how it is, and this is how it always is, and there's no deviation. And where God has given us the best truths on how to live, he still is open to our questions to let us wrestle through the difficult things of life, the difficult things that we run into. And I was blessed that God does not shy away from those questions that we ask. He's willing to walk with us and even bring understanding to why there are hard things in our world and why the struggle is real. Why is the struggle real? And so that just really encouraged me to not be afraid of the hard questions that we come in contact with. And it just really gave me a greater, love and trust in God, or belief in God. Because I guess as a parent, like, when your child questions you, it's like, no, this is how it is, and we're going to do it this way. And you don't want them to question you because, sometimes I'm not always sure the right answer, but, I know this is the best way to go, or I think this is the best way to go. But God, He welcomes our questions. He welcomes our conversation with Him. Like, God, why is it this way? And I'm just really blessed by that we get to serve a God who walks with us and wants to have that relationship, wants to have that conversation with us each day as we encounter difficult situations in life. But just some thoughts that I've been kind of wrestling with and thinking through. This time let's look at Luke chapter 20. If you're in the Red Pew Bible, it's page 772. We'll just be reading verses 1 through 26. And it came to pass that on one of these days, as he taught the people in the temple and preached the gospel, the chief priests and scribes came upon him with the elders, and spake unto him, saying, Tell us, by what authority does thou these things? Or who is he that gives thee this authority? And he answered and said unto them, I will also ask thee one thing, and answer me. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or of man? And they reasoned with themselves, saying, If we shall say, From heaven, he shall say, Why then believe ye him not? But if we say, Of men, all the people will stone us, for they be persuaded that John was a prophet. And they answered that they could not tell whence it was. And Jesus said unto them, Neither tell I you by what authority I do these things. Then began he to speak to the people this parable. A certain man planted a vineyard, and led it forth to husbandmen, and went into a far country for a long time. And at the season he sent a servant to the husbandmen, and that they should give him of the fruit of the vineyard. But the husbandmen beat him, and sent him away empty. And again he sent another servant, and they beat him also, and entreated him shamefully, and sent him away empty. And again he sent a third, and they wounded him also, and cast him out. Then said the Lord of the vineyard, What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. It may be they will receive him when they see him. But when the husbandmen saw him, they reasoned among themselves, saying, Hey, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, that the inheritance may be ours. So they cast him out of the vineyard, and killed him. That therefore shall the Lord of the vineyard do, what therefore shall the Lord of the vineyard do unto them? He shall come and destroy these husbandmen, and shall give the vineyard to others. And when they heard it, they said, God forbid. And he beheld them and said, What is this then that is written? The stone which the builder rejected, the same is become the head of the corner. Whosoever shall fall upon that stone shall be broken, but on whosoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder. And the chief priests and the scribes the same hour sought to lay hands on him, and they feared the people, for they perceived that he had spoken this parable against them. And they watched him, and sent forth spies which should feign themselves just men, that they might take hold of his words, that so they might deliver him under the power and authority of the governor. And they asked him, saying, Master, we knew that thou saith and teachest rightly, neither accepteth thou the person of any, but teaches the way of God truly. Is it lawful for us to give tribute unto Caesar, or no? But he perceived their craftiness, and said unto them, Why tempt ye me? Show me a penny. Whose image and inscription hath it? They answered and said, Caesar's. And he said unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things which be God's. And they could not take hold of his words before the people, and they marveled at his answer, and held their peace. All right, let's stand for a word of prayer. God, we just come before you this morning thanking you for calling us to follow you, and for not only calling us, but going before us and preparing the way in which we should walk. God, we thank you for taking the scars on the cross for us. We thank you for taking that punishment. And God, we just pray that you would continue to open our eyes to what you're calling us into and the path that you would desire us to take. God, I just pray you bless Sheldon this morning, that you would give him grace and that you give him strength, that you give him boldness as he shares the word before us, that you would have him to share. God, I just pray that you would set a hedge of protection around him and around this building, and that it may be a place where your teaching can have free will to work in our lives and in our hearts. God, I pray that you would continue to soften our hearts to the message that you would have, that you would continue to give us the grace and strength we need to follow you and to give our lives to you. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. You may be seated. October 9th was Pastor's Appreciation Day. And so in lieu of that, we'd like to share a short film and a song to share some of our appreciation for those who have been willing to step up and lead our flock and to be up here every Sunday guiding the study. So at this time, we'll have that video.
Say thank you for all that you've done. You don't hear those words often enough. You've been a true friend when I needed your time. Because of all you've done, you've truly changed my life. Where would I God knows if I'd be here at all. I just want to say thank you for proving how much you really care. Without all the prayers you prayed for me, where would I be? Told me the truth when I didn't want to hear it. You knew I needed help, even though I couldn't see it. Looking back, you have saved me from so many regrets. You're a living example of who Jesus really is. Where would I be if you had not answered the call? Without your sacrifice of love, only God knows if I'd be here at all. And I just want to say thank you for proving how much you really care. Without all the prayers you prayed for me, where would I be? For the times you held me up when I was feeling weak, for all the ways you've given so unselfishly, for the days that you pressed on, even when you were so tired, for the times you called my name in the middle of the night. Where would I be
Good morning, and thank you. The National Library of Jamaica. If you ever visit that place, you can find a collection of manuscripts there. They are known as the Shark Papers. They are a collection of receipts and bills, notary documents, and some other paperwork that formed the registration and the bookkeeping on a cargo ship in years past. It would have been quite common 200 years ago or so. So why are these particular papers on display in this museum? The year was 1799. An American ship by the name of the Nancy sailed out of Baltimore, Maryland, headed for Haiti to trade. Thomas Briggs was the captain. It was a trip that that ship had made before. However, it was not without its risks. During this time, the British government had declared that the waters of the Caribbean were closed to American cargo ships. So it was deemed that any cargo ships that were found in that area were able to be captured and taken as prizes. On August 28, 1799, the British warship Sparrow crossed paths with the Nancy. The captain suspected that this American ship might be conducting illegal trade in the Caribbean, and so he gave chase and he captured it. Once on board, however, he could find no evidence of what his hunch said. The captain was an American, but he said the ship was owned by a Dutch company, and he had paperwork to prove that. Still suspicious, however, the captain of the Sparrow sent the Nancy to Jamaica to have things sorted out in a court of law. It seemed like the captain of the Nancy was going to be acquitted, as there wasn't any real hard evidence against him. But then, just before the final ruling, another British ship by the name of the Ferret arrived in port. 2 days after the Nancy had been captured, the Ferret had managed to catch an unusually large shark. And while cleaning it, the crew ran across a bunch of papers tied with a string in the shark's stomach. They separated them, they laid them out to dry. Then they recognized them as the papers of a ship called the Nancy. And seeing that the dates were quite recent, they suspected that they had been tossed overboard to hide the identity of that ship. So they tied them all back together and rushed to Kingston, where they were brought into the court and used as evidence to convict Thomas Briggs of smuggling. He could hardly believe it. Later, he described it as the most active and unnatural piece of cruelty, that he was damned and condemned by a sharkfish. The jaws of that shark are, I believe, currently on display at the University of Jamaica as a reminder that honesty is always the best policy. Honesty and asking questions is something we're going to be discussing this morning. Tim, I thought it was interesting that you spent the opening talking about questions, because that's going to be something we're going to be looking at pretty much all throughout this message this morning. During Jesus' time on this earth, he was constantly asked questions. It seems that nearly everybody wanted to see what he would say on one issue or another. But Jesus didn't treat all these questions the same. If a person was truly seeking and was asking an honest question, Jesus answered it very patiently and gently and as directly as possible. But there were many who asked another kind of question. They did not ask in order to learn. They asked either to justify their own beliefs or in an attempt to trap Jesus. These were dishonest questions. They gave an outward appearance of wanting to learn, but their true purpose was something different entirely. And Jesus answered dishonest questions very differently than he answered honest ones. Two people could have the same question, and yet the answer would have been very different, depending on the heart and the motives of the person asking the question. Luke 20 contains several instances where Jesus was asked dishonest questions. These questions were asked by people who are critical of him. They were asked in an attempt to make him trip up in his words. Most of them were an attempt to turn people against him. Jesus' critics in this chapter are listed as chief priests, scribes, elders, Sadducees, and spies that were sent by these groups. And we might wonder where the Pharisees are on this list, and they are not listed by name, but it is generally believed that the group of scribes was at least mostly Pharisees. Luke 20 consists of these conflicts between Jesus and his critics, and it's just one conflict after another. As soon as you get done with one, it's another conflict, and then that one's done, and then it's another one. Why were they so intent on attacking Jesus during this time? We see them attacking him, here and there throughout his ministry, but why does it seem to be ratcheted up a notch? And in order to understand why, I think we'd have to look back at what has just happened, what we've just come out of in the previous chapter. The final 4 verses of Luke chapter 19 say this: Then he went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in it, saying to them, "It is written, my house is a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." And he was teaching daily in the temple, but the chief priests and the scribes and the leaders of the people sought to destroy him, and were unable to do anything, for all the people were very attentive to hear him. So just previous to this chapter, Jesus had come into Jerusalem. He had driven the money changers and the animal sellers out of the temple. He also accused them of making the temple into a den of thieves. And so the money changers were charging an exorbitant fee to change foreigners' money into the temple shekel. The sellers of animals were overpricing the animals they were selling to those who had come to worship. They were effectively running a scam in church. But why did this cause so much conflict with the chief priests and the scribes and the Sadducees? These people were the leaders of the temple. It would seem that Jesus was acting in their best interest, cleaning up the temple, driving them out, returning it back to a place of worship. But the only reason those people were in the temple at all is because they were allowed to do that by the religious leaders. These groups of religious leaders were in a position of authority, and they ran the temple. They said who could be there. They were the ones who gave these sellers permission to be there. And they did it because they were part of the scam. They were in on the take. They were making money off of it, of what the sellers and the money changers were doing. They may have even been the ones who came up with it and hired these people to operate in the temple. I think there's a good chance of that. One of the reasons why the animal sellers were able to sell as many animals as they did is because the priests would find illegitimate reasons to refuse the animals. A worshiper would bring a lamb that fit the description of an unblemished animal, but the priest would find some reason to disqualify it. Now the worshiper was forced to buy another one if he wanted to worship. And then the animals would take the blemished one off his hands. Then magically the blemished lamb would be approved to sell to somebody else. They just keep rotating the animals through and making a bunch of money off of each of them. But for that to work, the priests needed to be in on it. When Jesus drove out the sellers from the temple, he hit the priests and the other religious leaders in their wallets. Immediately after this, chapter 20, they are on him. They are at him. They are trying to discredit him. They're trying to trap him. And I tend to think it's not a coincidence that this is right after Jesus drove those people out of the temple. The first conflict that we find is right at the very beginning of Luke 20. Now it happened on one of those days as he taught the people in the temple and preached the gospel that the chief priests and the scribes, together with the elders, confronted him and spoke to him, saying, "Tell us, by what authority are you doing these things? Or who is he who gave you this authority? Tell us." By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you the authority to come into our temple and drive out the money changers and animal sellers? We are the authority of the temple. Who gave you the authority to do this in our domain? And the answer is quite simple, right? It's an easy answer. Jesus had gotten his authority from the Father. He had gotten his authority from the God of the temple. And it would have been a simple answer. An answer that Jesus would have likely given to an honest questioner. But these were not honest questions. And Jesus did not give the simple answer. He had previously told where he had gotten his authority. All they really had to do was accept what he had said before. There was no point in repeating what he had already said, but even more than that, the leaders were trying to trap Jesus. They were trying to turn the people against him. Perhaps if he blatantly claimed to be God, it would turn some of the people away. The people no doubt believed Jesus was a prophet. But the Christ? That might have been a stretch. And so Jesus takes a different approach. But he answered and said to them, I also will ask you one thing, and answer me. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or from men? And this question may seem kind of like Jesus is being evasive, just kind of diverting. But it's actually quite pertinent to the question that they asked him. Jesus' question put them in a tough spot. They had been trying to play the people against Jesus, but now they were in danger of having the people turn against them. They couldn't say the baptism of John was from men, even though that's what they believed, because they were surrounded by a crowd of people, and most of them believed that John was a true prophet of God. The people believed it so strongly that the religious leaders actually feared for their lives if they were to say the baptism of John was from men. Isn't that interesting? The second option the leaders could say is that it was from God. But if they were to do that, they would have been answering the question that they had asked Jesus. John's very purpose on this earth was to prepare the way for the Messiah. It was what he preached. It was what he taught. It was why he baptized. And when Jesus showed up, John proclaimed that this was the Son of God, the one that he had been talking about. If the religious leaders said that John the Baptist was a prophet from God, they would also have to accept that Jesus was the Messiah. Of course, they didn't want to do that. So they decided it was best not to give an answer. Verse 7 says, So they answered that they did not know where it was from. And Jesus said to them, Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. When he was asked a dishonest question, Jesus responded in several different ways. But I believe each of his responses served the same purpose. They were designed to expose the dishonest motives of the questioner. They were designed to lay bare the preconceived ideas and beliefs that were the driving force behind asking the question in the first place. In this instance, we see that Jesus answered the dishonest question with another question. Had his question been answered honestly, it would have exposed the critics' unbelief. Despite what John had done, they refused to believe he was sent from God. They refused to believe John was a prophet. And of course, they would also refuse to believe that Jesus was the Christ. They were tied together. His question forced them to consider their motives, but it also exposed them to the crowds who were present in the audience. Here were these religious leaders, and they couldn't even decide if John was from God or not. It showed the people that they were less concerned about the truth than they were about holding on to their power and their authority. They would not state the obvious fact that the crowd knew to be true because it would make them look foolish. They had not believed what John had preached. They had not repented. They were shown to be hypocrites to the crowd, concerned more about their power than about following the way of God. Jesus then goes on to share a parable in verses 9 through 16. Jesus told this parable following the first confrontation. And it's a story of a vineyard, but it was clear to all who were present and listening that it was not just a story of a vineyard. It's a revamping of a story told by the prophet Isaiah, actually, in Isaiah 5. I'm going to read first 5 verses of Isaiah 5. Now let me sing to my well-beloved, a song of my beloved regarding his vineyard. My well-beloved has a vineyard on a very fruitful hill. He dug it up and cleared out the stones and planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in the midst and also made a winepress in it. So he expected it to bring forth good grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Israel and men of Judah, judge, please, between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why then, when I expected it to bring forth good grapes, did it bring forth wild grapes? And now please let me tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it shall be burned, and break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will lay it waste. It shall not be pruned or dug, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are its pleasant plant. He looked for justice, but behold oppression, for righteousness, but behold a cry for help. Just as it was in Isaiah 5, the vineyard in Jesus' story represented the nation of Israel, and the owner of the vineyard represented God. In Isaiah's parable, the problem was with the vineyard. God had done everything that was necessary to produce a good crop, and still the vineyard didn't produce. But in Jesus' parable here in Luke 20, the vineyard was not the problem. It was the caretakers of the vineyard. It was the caretakers who didn't hold up their end of the bargain. It was the caretakers who refused to pay what they had agreed to pay. It was the caretakers who abused those that the owner sent to collect payment. It was the caretakers who eventually killed the son of the owner. And when Jesus told his own parable of the vineyard, all those who heard it knew exactly what the vineyard represented. They knew exactly who the owner represented. And they also understood who the caretakers were. And when they heard it, they said, "Certainly not." I don't know this for certain, but I suspect that it was not the whole crowd of people that said, "Certainly not." I suspect it was the religious leaders who were still present. It was understood that they were the caretakers, and I believe it's they who responded emphatically, "Certainly not. We will never do such a thing." And yet the leaders of Israel had already fulfilled a large part of that story. The past leaders of Israel had persecuted and killed the prophets that God had formerly sent. The only part of the story that had not yet been fulfilled was the killing of the son. And that would take place soon enough. Now, the telling of this story is not a direct answer to a question by Jesus' critics. But it is a continued attempt by Jesus to show the dishonesty and the hypocrisy of the religious leaders, both to themselves and to the crowd. Jesus was calling all of them to a higher standard. And while this story is it's harsh in its depiction of the religious leaders, Jesus did not share it just to be harsh. He was trying to bring conviction to the religious leaders so that they could repent and be saved themselves. It was tough love. Jesus often used stories to answer dishonest questions. Stories allow a person to draw their own conclusion about what is right and proper, rather than simply being told. They're effective. They effectively cause the person to answer their own question. At times, Jesus told parables so that only those who had ears to hear could hear. But that's not the case here in this instance. This is not the case when he's answering a dishonest question. The meaning of the story is clear to all. Those with a Jewish background understood the meaning. The story of the Good Samaritan is another example of this. In that instance, there was a certain lawyer that stood up. And he asked the first question to test him. And he wanted to justify himself. And again, Jesus was dealing with a dishonest question, not someone who wanted to learn, but somebody who wanted to test him and wanted to justify himself. And the second question that he asked, or the first question was for the purpose of testing, and the second question was for the purpose of making himself feel good, justify him. Who is my neighbor was the second question. Instead of simply answering a dishonest question, Jesus shared a clear story, then asked the lawyer the question, which of these three do you think was neighbor to him who fell among thieves? The story was clear. The answer was clear. But Jesus did not answer the question directly. He made the man draw the conclusion to the story himself. He made the man answer his own question. Sometimes Jesus answered with questions. Sometimes he answered with stories. Moving on further in Luke 20, we see that Jesus also answered his critics with object lessons. We have two object lessons that Jesus uses in the next few verses. First, he compares himself to the cornerstone of a building. And this is really just a follow-up to the story of the vineyard. Just as the son of the vineyard owner was rejected and killed by those running the vineyard, he likens himself to a stone that is rejected by the people who are building a house. But he adds more information to it, and it's wonderful information, because in the story of the vineyard, all we see is that the son was killed. But in the object lesson of the cornerstone, we see that the stone was rejected, but then later it became the key piece to the house. So it's information that the son does not stay dead. Jesus' second object lesson that he has here is in response to this question. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Again, we find this is not an honest question brought by someone who's struggling with the answer. This is brought to him by spies that were sent who were pretending to be righteous, it says. It was a question that was designed to trap Jesus, to turn either the people against him or the Romans against him, one or the other. And Jesus uses a Roman coin to illustrate the difference between our earthly responsibilities and our spiritual responsibilities. And in so doing, he also illustrates to us one way to avoid a question that's designed as a trap. A trap question is it's designed to have no good answer. That either way you go, you're kind of caught. That's the whole purpose of it. It's designed so that if you say yes, it's trouble. If you say no, it's trouble. And this is one of the reasons that Jesus so frequently doesn't answer a question with a simple yes or no. Often he brings out a third option that maybe the questioner wasn't thinking about, and that's what he does here. Verse 26 says, "But they could not catch him in his words in the presence of the people, and they marveled at his answer and kept silent." Jesus' attackers were amazed at the understanding of his answers and at his ability to avoid becoming trapped, even when they had thought up a question that they thought surely had him. But despite their marveling, they refused to admit their own dishonesty or make a choice to believe. Next up was the Sadducees. They finally joined in their attempts to trap Jesus. Starting in verse 27, then some of the Sadducees who denied that there's a resurrection came to him and asked him, saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote to us that if a man's brother dies, having a wife, and he dies without children, his brother should take his wife and raise up offspring for his brother." And then they go into this long, probably made-up story, probably a kind of a stock story that they would use to explain how ridiculous the resurrection was. And they go off into this whole thing of how all 7 brothers had the same wife, and none of them had children with her, and who's going to be married to her in the resurrection? And again, we're dealing with a dishonest question because they didn't even believe there was a resurrection. This question was an attempt by the Sadducees to make Jesus look foolish. And this question, Jesus does actually answer in a fairly straightforward manner. But once again, he does so in a way that exposes the Sadducees' misconceptions. It exposed an inaccurate and preconceived idea that the Sadducees held. If you've done any study into Pharisees and Sadducees and all this stuff, the Sadducees were kind of the liberals of their day, what we would maybe think of. They had a very low view of Scripture. They didn't hold to, well, they only held to the first 5 books of the Bible. And even those, they were kind of a little wishy-washy on that when it was convenient or inconvenient, however. So they had a pretty low view of Scripture. They did not believe in anything that was supernatural. They had a very earthly view, kind of what they could see and what they could think. That was about as far as their Judaism went. Jesus knew what they believed and how they thought, and he met them on their own turf. He showed from Exodus, one of the books of the Bible that they believed was Scripture, how their beliefs were wrong. Verse 37. But even Moses showed in the burning bush passage that the dead are raised when he called the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, for he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. And again, those who questioned him were complimentary of his answer. It says, then some of the scribes answered and said, Jesus, you have spoken well. But after that, they dared not question him anymore. Which is kind of funny. If the scribes were the Pharisees, they were probably kind of liked what Jesus said, but nobody wanted to question anymore. Throughout this chapter, we've seen that Jesus answered critics in a number of ways. He did so by questioning them. He did so by telling stories. He used object lessons. He used the questioner's own beliefs. And yet, what purpose did it serve? It was good that the Sadducees and the Pharisees and others who attacked Jesus realized and appreciated the wisdom with which he spoke, yet we have no record of any of them being swayed. None of these examples conclude with the conversion of any of these critics. But despite this, there are several positive things that we can take away from Jesus' responses. We see in the chapter that a critic is rarely swayed. By the time a person gets to the point of trying to trap others, they've become very deeply entrenched in their belief system. We get to the point where you're willing to challenge another rather than just listening and conversing. You're at a pretty strong point. So a change from that strong position doesn't usually happen really quickly or easily. We have record in Acts 15 that there were Pharisees who were a part of the church, the young church at that time. It says they were Pharisees who believed. Now, they were still causing trouble. They were still having a hard time letting go of the law, but they were believers in the church. They had chosen to follow Christ. Now, we don't know how they came to that belief. We're not told that. But it would be unwise for us to assume that just because a critic continues to attack, that there is no change beginning, that there are no seeds being planted. And despite the lack of initial response, these answers of Jesus may have been the seeds that later grew into belief for some of these people. The second positive that came from Jesus' answers is that it exposed the corruption of the religious leaders to the people. And for those who are part of the audience throughout these interactions, and they got to see firsthand the wisdom of Jesus compared to the inconsistencies and the hypocrisy of the religious leaders, it made it very clear to those looking on who they wanted to follow. And I don't doubt that this caused many people to turn from empty works to believe in Jesus and the claims that he made. I brought along this morning a quarter, just a regular quarter. It was in the little coin bowl there. It is a 1965. It's a shame it wasn't a 1964. It'd be worth about $6 more if it was. There are 4 inscriptions that are on any coin of common denomination here in the United States. Do you know what they are? Pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters. There are 4 things that you will find on every single one of those. Words, inscriptions. In God we trust, that's one. I'm glad someone said that instead of me. I did research that. It means from many one, so it's basically unity. That's 2. Any more? What was that? It does say that, yes, but that can vary. It can be Philadelphia or Denver. I don't know, I'm not finding it on this one, but yes, it is on there somewhere. The word liberty you will find on all coins, and also United States of America. So those are 4 things that you will find on all the coins. I'm kind of surprised that in the world that we live in today, that the words "in God we trust" are still on all of our coins and dollars. I'm surprised that somebody hasn't raised a lawsuit about it, and that it's a violation of separation of church and state. That's just amazing to me that it's still there. I don't know how much longer it'll be there. But we live in a culture that thinks that it knows better than God. It thinks that God is an outdated idea. It thinks that God is nothing more than a crutch for the weak. And these are the prevailing ideas that are being pushed in our society. This is the culture that we live in. There are some people that simply accept these beliefs because they're popular. They don't maybe give them a lot of thought. They maybe aren't deeply entrenched in it. They're not really sure. They have doubts. They have questions about it. They have honest questions. And when we're presented with those, we should be very clear in our answers, but very gentle and very careful with them. But there are also those who are rabidly against the gospel. They are ready to attack those who believe in God or the Bible. They think they have it all figured out. And they're ready to try to prove why they are right and to demean those who would disagree. And there are also those in our world that would consider themselves to be believers, and they may even be believers. But like the previous group, they also think they have it all figured out. And they are on a mission to prove to everyone else that they are right. They will ask questions with the intent of trapping others. They will ask questions with the intent of trying to force a certain answer, to force a person to agree with them or look foolish if they don't. Both of these groups have similarities to the religious leaders of Jesus' time. Both these groups are self-righteous. One in their religion, and another in their lack of it. And we should take our cues from the way Jesus handled them. Be clear. Be bold. Do not shy away from saying hard things. Don't beat around the bush. If we do that, the message will not get through. Jesus certainly did not beat around the bush. He was very clear. But more than that, do not get caught up in the games that these people will play. Whenever Jesus was confronted with a dishonest question or a trap question, he always turned the conversation toward the motives behind it. He rarely engaged in the question until he had exposed the reason why it was being asked. He didn't let these self-righteous people off the hook. He made it clear that he knew what they were doing. And we should do the same. If a question is being asked to us dishonestly, we should point that out. We must expose it because it forces the person to consider the deeper issues of the heart, rather than just allowing them to play up on the surface of rules and arguments and opinions. Again, the likelihood of that person being visibly convicted and changing their way in that moment is small, if the Bible is any indication of it. but forcing the conversation to issues of the heart may well have long-term effects for the good. It may be the seed which later brings a godless critic to the Lord. It may be the start of conviction which draws a self-righteous person from religion into relationship with God. Or at the very least, it may give us a little peace, if like Jesus they dare not question us anymore. Jeremiah 17:9 says this. It's very familiar, but it's what Jesus did. It says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" But verse 10, "I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind." May that be our goal as we deal with those that question, especially dishonestly question, the claims that Jesus makes, the claims that the Bible makes, that we would turn them to the heart, because that is where God is interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheldon, for being faithful.